My Social Security check comes to $1,347 a month. I want to start with that exact number, because this whole story is really about what that number could and couldn't do for me in two different places, and I think the specifics matter more than the general shape of it. In Kansas City, Missouri, where I lived for 41 years, that $1,347 didn't cover my rent and utilities combined. Not by a considerable margin, which meant every month was an exercise in quiet, exhausting triage, deciding which bill got paid in full, which got paid partially, and which got a phone call asking for an extension I dreaded making. In Oaxaca, Mexico, that same $1,347 covers my rent, my utilities, my groceries, my health care, my phone, and leaves me with money left over most months. Enough that I bought myself a proper coffee maker last spring, simply because I wanted one. A purchase that would have been unthinkable in my last 2 years in Kansas City. I am 67 years old, and I want to tell you honestly how I ended up on a Social Security check that small. Because I think a lot of women watching this recognize some version of my story even if the specific details differ. I spent 34 years working as a school paraprofessional in the Kansas City area, helping special education students in elementary classrooms, a job I loved and was genuinely good at, and a job that, like so much education support work, paid modestly enough that my lifetime earnings, and therefore my eventual Social Security benefit, reflected that modesty precisely. My husband, Wayne, passed away 11 years ago from complications of diabetes. And while I did receive a small survivor benefit adjustment, it wasn't enough to meaningfully change the math I'd been living inside for years by that point. I want to be specific about what those 34 years actually looked like financially, because I think the phrase paraprofessional doesn't fully convey it to people outside education. I made $19,400 my final year before retiring, after 3 decades of steady, incremental raises that never quite kept pace with the cost of living in the way I'd been told they eventually would. Wayne worked as a warehouse supervisor for most of our marriage, a solid, dependable job that provided the bulk of our household income while I worked mostly for the health insurance and the sense of purpose the job gave me. A common arrangement for women of my generation that, I understand now, left me considerably more financially exposed than I fully appreciated at the time. When Wayne died, I lost not just my husband of 32 years, but the larger half of our household income. And the survivor benefit adjustment the Social Security Administration eventually processed, while genuinely helpful, was calculated against my own comparatively modest lifetime earnings record, rather than fully replacing what we'd built together. I spent those 11 years since Wayne's death gradually, quietly downsizing my own expectations, without ever quite naming the process to myself as downsizing. I sold our modest 3-bedroom house 4 years after he died, once the mortgage payoff and the maintenance costs became more than my income alone could reasonably absorb, and moved into the 1-bedroom apartment that would eventually become the site of so much careful, exhausting budget triage. I want to say plainly that none of this happened through any particular failure of planning on my part. Wayne and I did what we were told to do. Worked steadily, paid our bills, contributed what we could to retirement accounts on top of Social Security. It simply wasn't enough, in the specific American cities where we happened to build our life, to produce a retirement that could comfortably absorb the loss of a spouse and the ordinary cost increases of the following decade. I want to describe what those last 2 years in Kansas City actually looked like, because I think the specifics matter more than a general description of struggle. My 1-bedroom apartment, a modest unit in a decent but unremarkable part of town, cost $895 a month by my final year there, up from $650 when I'd first signed the lease 8 years earlier. Utilities, gas and electric combined, ran another $140 in the winter months, less in summer. But Kansas City winters are not gentle. And I learned to keep my thermostat lower than I was comfortable with more nights than I want to admit. That left, after rent and utilities alone, somewhere between $250 and $300 for absolutely everything else. Groceries, my prescription copays, my car insurance, gas for the car I needed to reach the pharmacy and the grocery store, my phone bill, any incidental expense at all. I want to be honest about what that math actually required of me, because I think too many stories about financial hardship stay vague in a way that lets the listener avoid really sitting with it. I skipped filling one of my blood pressure prescriptions on 3 separate occasions during my last year in Kansas City, not because I didn't understand the risk, but because the copay landed in the same week as a utility bill, and something had to give. I ate considerably less meat than I would have liked, not from any dietary preference but from simple cost, relying heavily on rice and beans and whatever produce was cheapest that particular week. I stopped seeing my dentist entirely for the last 3 years I lived there. Not from any decision about priorities, but because there simply wasn't a version of my monthly budget that included it. I want to say clearly that I am not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you because I think an enormous number of retired women in this country are living some version of this exact math right now. Quietly, without saying much about it to anyone. The way I didn't for years. I remember a specific Tuesday, roughly 18 months before I moved, when my car needed a repair I genuinely couldn't afford. A part costing $340 that the mechanic explained wasn't optional. The vehicle wasn't safe to drive without it. I sat in that repair shop's waiting room doing the same anxious mental arithmetic I'd been doing for years. Moving numbers between categories that had no real slack left to give. And I remember thinking, with a kind of flat, exhausted clarity, that I had built an entire adult life of hard work and careful decisions, and had somehow still arrived at a point where a $340 car repair felt like a genuine crisis rather than an ordinary inconvenience. I didn't tell Brian about that particular week for months afterward, partly out of pride. Partly because I didn't want him worrying from 400 miles away about something he couldn't actually fix. It was my niece, Ashley, who first mentioned Mexico to me, during a visit 2 Christmases before I actually moved. Mentioning almost in passing that a coworker's mother had retired to somewhere called Oaxaca on a Social Security check similar in size to mine, and seemed, from what Ashley had heard secondhand, to be living considerably more comfortably than I was. I remember my first reaction wasn't hope, it was something closer to suspicion. A lifetime of being told, implicitly and explicitly, that moving somewhere cheaper meant accepting somewhere worse, that there had to be a catch I wasn't seeing. I let the idea sit for nearly 4 months before I mentioned it to anyone else, turning it over privately, running through all the reasons it probably wouldn't work for someone like me, someone who'd never lived outside the Midwest, who didn't speak Spanish beyond a handful of restaurant menu words, who had spent her entire adult life being the responsible, careful one in every room she occupied. Ashley brought it up again at Easter, this time with an actual name, mentioning that her coworker's mother had a blog where she posted her monthly budget in detail, real numbers, not vague reassurances. I asked for the link mostly to prove to myself, I think, that it wouldn't hold up to scrutiny. I looked into it anyway, mostly because Ashley kept gently bringing it up over the following months, and what I found genuinely surprised me. Oaxaca, along with several other Mexican cities with established retiree communities, offered a cost of living low enough that a Social Security check my size, one that barely covered rent and utilities in Kansas City, could reasonably cover an entire comfortable life. I built a spreadsheet, the same way I'd built careful, anxious budgets my entire adult life, except this one. For the first time in years, had numbers on it that made me feel something other than dread. I spent nearly 2 months reading through that coworker's mother's blog archive, along with a dozen other similar accounts I found through the same expat forums, cross-referencing their numbers against each other to make sure I wasn't simply finding one lucky outlier. I read about the residency visa requirements, which for a retiree required demonstrating a modest, specific monthly income, an amount my Social Security check, once I checked the current threshold, actually cleared without difficulty. a detail that struck me as almost absurd given how insufficient that same exact number had felt for years back home. I read about safety, about healthcare quality, about the practical logistics of receiving my Social Security deposit while living abroad, methodically working through every objection I could think to raise against my own growing hope, the way I'd once carefully checked a special education student's work for errors before letting either of us celebrate too soon. I flew down for a 10-day scouting trip, staying in a modest rented room I found through a Facebook group for women considering the move. And I want to walk you through the actual budget I built while I was there, line by line, because I think the specificity is the whole point of this story. Rent for a small one-bedroom apartment in a safe, walkable neighborhood near the historic center ran, in the range I looked at, between $350 and $450 a month. Considerably less than half what I'd been paying in Kansas City for a comparable space. Utilities, electric, water, and gas combined typically came to $45 to $60 a month, partly because Oaxaca's climate requires far less heating and cooling than Kansas City's brutal seasonal swings. Groceries, shopping primarily at the daily markets rather than an American-style supermarket, ran roughly $180 to $220 a month for someone eating well. Actual meals, actual protein, not the rice and beans austerity I'd been managing at home. A cell phone plan with generous data ran about $15 a month. Basic private health insurance, which I researched carefully given my blood pressure history, cost me $58 a month for a policy with considerably better coverage than the copay structure that had made me skip prescriptions back home. I want to pause on that health insurance line specifically, because it mattered enormously to me. My first checkup here, including blood work and a consultation with a doctor who spent a genuinely unhurried 30 minutes reviewing my history, cost $35 total. Copay included, less than a single blood pressure prescription copay had cost me some months in Kansas City. I haven't skipped a single prescription since I've been here, not once. A fact that still catches in my throat a little when I think about it, because I spent years quietly accepting that as simply how my life worked. If any of you are doing this same math right now, staring at a Social Security number that doesn't stretch far enough to cover the basics, I want you to comment below and tell me what that number is. Because I read every single one, and I think a great many of us have been quietly doing this exact triage for years, without ever saying the actual figures out loud to anyone. I moved to Oaxaca permanently 5 months after that scouting trip, into a one-bedroom apartment renting for $395 a month in a neighborhood called Halatlaco. Cobblestone streets and colorful facades. A 15-minute walk from the historic center. I want to give you my actual full monthly budget now. The real one, not the estimated one from my scouting trip. Because I think seeing the complete picture matters. Rent, $395. Utilities, $52 on average across the year. Groceries, $195, shopping mostly at the Mercado Sniches Pascuas near my apartment, where a vendor named Doa Carmen has learned my regular order and sets aside the best tomatoes before the morning crowd arrives. Health insurance, $58. Phone, $15. A weekly Spanish class, $20 a month total. That comes to $735. Which leaves, out of my $1,347 check, over $600 for everything else. Dining out occasionally. Transportation. The modest, ordinary pleasures I'd nearly forgotten were supposed to be part of a regular life. A movie ticket. A new pair of shoes when my old ones actually wore through instead of being stretched another 6 months past reasonable. I want to tell you about the specific moment I understood how much had actually changed, because I think it matters more than any spreadsheet. About 4 months after I arrived, I woke up with a scratchy throat and a slight fever. Nothing serious, but enough that the old Kansas City version of me would have spent the whole day doing anxious mental math about whether a doctor's visit was worth the copay, whether I could simply wait it out instead. Here, I walked to a small clinic 2 blocks from my apartment, was seen within 20 minutes, paid $30 for the visit and a course of antibiotics, and was back home resting by early afternoon, having spent less time and worry on the entire experience than I used to spend just deciding whether to call my old doctor's office back home. I sat on my small balcony that evening, medication already picked up and waiting on the counter, and found myself doing something I hadn't done in years, which was simply feeling mildly unwell without the accompanying financial dread that used to arrive alongside almost any physical symptom back home. I'd forgotten, I realized, what it felt like to get sick and think only about getting better, rather than running an immediate, reflexive calculation about whether getting better was something my budget that particular week could actually accommodate. It's a small thing, I know, a scratchy throat and a mild fever. Nothing dramatic enough to make for a very cinematic turning point. But I think about that ordinary Tuesday more than almost any other single day since I've been here, because it was the first time the change stopped being a number on a spreadsheet and became something I could actually feel in my body. Doa Carmen, at the market, has become something close to a friend over these past 18 months, always asking after my health, occasionally sending me home with an extra handful of herbs she insists will help whatever minor ailment I've mentioned that week. My next-door neighbor, a Mexican woman named Yolanda, retired herself, has taught me more practical Spanish over shared coffee on our shared landing than any class could have, and invited me, my first December here, to join her family's posada celebrations. A tradition I'd never experienced and now genuinely look forward to each year. I've also joined a small group of 5 other American and Canadian women, all retired on modest fixed incomes similar to mine, who meet every other Wednesday for coffee and, more often than not, an unofficial, ongoing exchange of practical tips. Which pharmacy has the best prices? Which market stall sells the freshest fish? Small pieces of shared knowledge that have made my own budget stretch even further than it did in my first few careful months here. Ashley, the niece who first mentioned Oaxaca to me, visited last spring, and I watched her do the math herself, openly, sitting at my small kitchen table, comparing what I now spend to what she's currently paying for a studio apartment back in Kansas City that's smaller than mine and costs nearly 4 times as much. She asked me, near the end of her visit, whether I ever felt like I'd given something up by leaving, whether the smaller apartment, the more modest lifestyle by American standards, felt like a step down. I told her honestly that it felt like the opposite, that for the first time in over a decade, my monthly budget had stopped being a source of dread and started being, simply, a document I glanced at occasionally to confirm what I already knew, that I had enough. My son Brian, out in Denver, was more skeptical when I first told him about the move. Worried in the specific way adult children worry about a parent making a major decision alone, asking a dozen careful questions about safety, about healthcare access, about what would happen if something went seriously wrong. I answered every one as honestly as I could, and I think what finally settled him wasn't any single answer, but simply watching, over these 18 months, that his mother sounded steadier on our weekly calls than she had in years. No longer opening conversations with the quiet, exhausted arithmetic of bills that used to color nearly everything I said. Brian visited this past winter, his first trip, and I watched him do the same silent recalculation I've seen in nearly everyone who visits, comparing the specific, tangible reality of my life here against whatever cautious, hedged version he'd been imagining from 400 miles away. He met Doa Carmen at the market, watched Yolanda wave to me from her balcony as we walked past, sat in on one of my Wednesday coffee mornings with the other women, and left, by his own admission, faintly astonished at how much of an actual social life his mother had built on a budget he'd assumed would only afford isolation. On his last night, he told me he'd stopped worrying, not because I'd convinced him with arguments, but because he'd simply seen it, the market, the neighbors, the doctor 2 blocks away, and understood, the way I had, that the math had genuinely changed and wasn't simply something I was insisting on for his benefit. I think about that $1,347 number often. Still, because I think it's the whole story in a single figure. It was the same number in Kansas City and in Oaxaca. The number never changed. What changed was everything around it. The cost of the roof over my head, the cost of the food on my table, the cost of the medication that keeps my blood pressure in check. All of it recalibrated by geography into something that number could actually support, rather than something it could only partially, anxiously, incompletely cover. I spent years believing that number simply wasn't enough, that I'd have to keep triaging bills and skipping prescriptions and doing without a dentist indefinitely, because that belief had never once been seriously tested against an alternative. It turns out the number was never the problem. It just needed a different place to land. I think about that mechanic's waiting room sometimes too, that Tuesday with the $340 repair that felt, at the time, like evidence of some fundamental failure on my part. Some quiet proof that I hadn't managed my life correctly. I know now that the failure was never mine. I worked 34 years. I raised a good son. I paid every bill I possibly could for over a decade after Wayne died. And none of that diligence was ever going to be enough to fix a math problem that no amount of personal discipline could solve. Because the problem was never really about discipline. It was about geography. And I only discovered that once I finally let myself look somewhere else. I'm Sharon Kelly. Thank you for listening to Women Choose Mexico.